One wanted the 400-pound mail-order bride, until the mountain man declared she's perfect. The stagecoach door creaks open. Dust swirls in the street. Laughter erupts as the crowd sneers at the woman stepping down, her trunk clutched tight, her face burning with shame. She came for a husband, but every man turns away. Then, boots strike the platform. A scarred mountain man thunders, "She's perfect. She's mine." Silence falls. But behind that bold claim lies a deadly truth. A greedy banker wants their land, their water, their very future. As fires rise and secrets are unearthed, this unlikely bride must prove her worth, not just to the town, but to herself. She holds more than a broken heart, she holds the key to justice for the whole valley. But when the flames close in and enemies close ranks, one question remains. Can love strong enough to defy ridicule survive a war for survival? Or will it all be burned to ash? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. Through the swirling dust of the late afternoon, Eleanor Hayes gripped the doorframe of the stagecoach, her knuckles white with tension. The worn leather seat creaked as she shifted her weight, gathering her courage to face what waited outside. The journey from Missouri had been long and uncomfortable, but this moment, stepping out into view, felt harder than all those days combined. "Need a hand down, miss?" The driver called from above, not unkindly. Eleanor nodded, though her throat was too tight to speak. She had written ahead about her size, been honest in her letters. But seeing was different than reading, she knew that well enough. The wooden steps groaned as she began her careful descent. The platform boards beneath her feet felt solid, thank heavens. But the whispers started immediately. They always did. Eleanor kept her eyes down, focused on each step, clutching her travel trunk close like armor against the growing murmurs. "Lord above, would you look at the size of her? Ain't never seen the like her. Must weigh 400 if she weighs a pound." The voices grew bolder and someone laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that made Eleanor flinch. She'd heard that laugh before, in other towns, other places. It never stopped hurting. Through her downcast eyes, she saw skirts swishing back, boots stepping away, making space, but not from politeness. Her cheeks burned hot despite the autumn chill. "Well, I never." The voice cut clear across the platform, a woman's voice, prim and properly scandalized. "Reverend's wife ought to know better than most about Christian charity," someone muttered, but Mrs. Preacher went right on. "This is meant to be a respectable town. She belongs in a traveling show, not here among decent folk." Eleanor's vision blurred. She'd been a fool to come, to believe things might be different here. Her letter writer hadn't come to meet her. Of course he hadn't. Who would want to claim such a bride in front of his neighbors? She should climb back in the coach, beg the driver to take her on to the next town, or back home to Missouri. She's perfect. The voice boomed out like thunder, deep and rough-edged. The crowd's tittering fell silent. "She's mine." Eleanor's head jerked up, her heart hammering. Through tears she hadn't let fall, she saw the crowd parting. A tall figure strode forward, his heavy boots striking the wooden planks with purpose. He was a giant of a man, broad-shouldered and raw-boned, with a thick dark beard shot through with gray. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to jaw, pulling that side of his face into a permanent half-scowl. His clothes were plain, but clean. Rough wool pants, sturdy boots, a cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up despite the cooling weather. A woodsman or logger by the look of him, with hands hardened by years of work. The crowd drew back further as he approached, but not from disgust this time. This was the kind of man others naturally made way for. He stopped directly in front of Eleanor, and she had to tip her head back to meet his eyes. They were a startling blue, clear as mountain springs, and they looked straight into hers without flinching or shifting away. "Silas Boone," he said, his voice quieter now but still carrying across the sudden hush of the platform. "I wrote to you about becoming my wife." Eleanor's hands trembled on her trunk, "But in your letters you didn't say that I was scarred up. Figured you'd see soon enough." His expression softened just slightly. "We both know appearances ain't the whole story of a person." Fresh whispers rippled through the watching crowd. Eleanor caught fragments, mountain man, and widow, and hasn't spoken 10 words together since. But Silas paid them no mind. He held out one large, calloused hand to her. "If you'll have me, Miss Hayes, I've got a wagon waiting. Home's up in the hills a ways, but the cabin's sound and there's good water. Won't be an easy life, but I'll treat you fair." Eleanor looked at his offered hand, then back to his steady gaze. There was no mockery there, no hidden cruel joke waiting to spring, just patient waiting, letting her choose. "I'm not," she started, then gathered her courage. "I'm not what most men would want in a wife." "Good thing I ain't most men, then." The scarred side of his mouth lifted slightly. "And I reckon I know my own mind about what I want." Someone in the crowd snickered, but Silas's head snapped around, those clear blue eyes turning to ice. The laughter died instantly. Turning back to Eleanor, his expression softened again. "What do you say, Miss Hayes? Will you take a chance on a rough old mountain man?" Eleanor looked at his outstretched hand again. She thought of all the doors that had closed in her face over the years, all the turned backs and whispered jokes. But here was a door opening, offered by a man who looked straight at her and saw something worth claiming. Her hand trembled as she placed it in his much larger one. "Yes, Mr. Boone, I will." His fingers closed warm and strong around hers. Without any apparent effort, he lifted her heavy trunk with his free hand. "Wagons this way. Mind your step on these boards. They get slick with the dust." As he led her through the parting crowd, Eleanor kept her chin up. Let them stare. Let them whisper. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't facing their judgment alone. They reached a solid wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses. Silas secured her trunk, then turned to help her up to the seat. His hands at her waist were respectful, but sure as he lifted, taking her weight as if it were nothing at all. "Much obliged," she murmured as she settled onto the wooden seat. He nodded, checking that she was steady before moving around to climb up beside her. Taking up the reins, he clicked to the horses. The wagon rolled forward, leaving the whispers and stares behind. Eleanor watched the little rail town recede, her heart still fluttering with disbelief at this sudden turn in her fate. "Thank you," she said softly when they'd gone a little way in silence, "for speaking up, for stopping them from—" "No need to thank me for doing what's right." His voice was gruff but gentle. "Had my fill of folks judging by outsides, not caring what's in a person's heart." He glanced sidelong at her. "Your letters showed me someone kind and practical, someone who knows about hard work and loneliness. That's what matters to me." Eleanor's eyes stung again, but not from shame this time. "Your letters showed me someone honest and decent. I'm glad they told true." He nodded, and they rode on in comfortable quiet as the wagon wound into the hills. The autumn air grew cooler as they climbed, laden with the scent of pine. Eleanor breathed it in, feeling something tight in her chest begin to loosen. Behind them, the sun sank toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Ahead, the mountain waited, offering a new beginning. Eleanor wasn't fool enough to think it would all be easy. Life never was, especially not on the frontier. But as she glanced at the steady presence beside her, she felt something she hadn't dared to hope for in a long time. She felt like she was finally coming home. The crowd at the station platform had slowly dispersed, shaking their heads and muttering about the strange events they'd witnessed. But a few lingered, watching the wagon until it disappeared into the gathering dusk. They would talk about this day for years to come, how Silas Boone, the silent mountain man, had claimed his unusual bride, how he'd faced down their judgment with those ice-blue eyes and called her perfect. And though they didn't know it yet, they would eventually talk about how that unlikely pair would become the heart of their community, teaching them all something about seeing past surfaces to the truth of a person's soul. But for now, the wagon climbed steadily into the hills, carrying Eleanor and Silas toward their shared future. The last rays of sunlight caught the dust of their passing, turning it to floating gold in the autumn air. The crowd shifted restlessly as Silas extended his hand toward Eleanor. Whispers rustled like autumn leaves across the platform, some mocking, others merely curious. Eleanor stared at his offered palm, broad and weathered, with calluses that spoke of years of hard work. Her own hand trembled slightly as she reached out, Miss Hayes? Silas's voice was quiet now, meant for her ears alone. His blue eyes held steady, patient. Drawing a deep breath, Eleanor placed her hand in his. His fingers closed gently but firmly around hers as she took that first step down from the stage. Despite her size, she moved with careful dignity, determined not to stumble. Silas adjusted his stance smoothly to support her weight, showing no strain. Well, well. A sleek voice cut through the murmuring crowd. Our mountain man appears to have taken leave of his senses entirely. Eleanor felt Silas stiffen beside her. Through the parting onlookers stepped a well-dressed gentleman, his suit fine enough for any city back east. His smile was practiced and sharp as a new blade. Mr. Alcott. Silas's greeting was cold as mountain snow. The banker adjusted his gold watch chain with manicured fingers. Really, Boone, I knew you were peculiar, living up in those hills alone. But this? His eyes raked dismissively over Eleanor. Surely you can't be serious. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could speak, Silas's hand tightened reassuringly on hers. Ain't requiring your approval, Alcott. Silas's voice remained level, though Eleanor felt the tension humming through him. Miss Hayes and I have business at the general store. If you'll excuse us. He guided Eleanor forward, his broad shoulders creating a path through the reluctant crowd. Some folks turned away with obvious disgust, while others watched with undisguised curiosity. Eleanor kept her chin up, though her heart pounded. She'd endured stares before, but never with someone standing beside her. The general store's bell jingled as they entered, the familiar scents of coffee, leather, and dried goods wrapped around them. Eleanor breathed easier in the relative privacy of the shop. Welcome, welcome. The shopkeeper bustled forward, his round face creased in a genuine smile. Silas Boone, rare enough to see you in town. And this must be... For Miss Eleanor Hayes, Silas said firmly. My intended... A pleasure, miss. The shopkeeper's smile never wavered. I'm Samuel Wright. My daughter Sarah helps me run the place. He gestured to a slight young woman organizing shelves nearby. Sarah approached shyly, her brown eyes kind. While Silas discussed supplies with Samuel, she drew Eleanor aside. You must be tired from your journey, Sarah said softly. Would you like to sit? We have a chair by the window. Eleanor blinked at the simple kindness. Thank you, yes. As she settled carefully onto the sturdy chair, Sarah disappeared briefly behind the counter. She returned with something wrapped in paper, pressing it into Eleanor's hand with a conspiratorial smile. Welcome to our town, she whispered. Eleanor unwrapped the paper to find a red and white striped peppermint stick. Such a small thing, but the thoughtful gesture brought unexpected tears to her eyes. She smiled, her first real smile since stepping off the stage. Much obliged, she managed, her voice rough with emotion. Sarah squeezed her hand once before returning to her work. Eleanor savored the sweet peppermint as she watched Silas select provisions: flour, coffee, salt pork, and other staples. His movements were efficient. A man used to stocking up for long stretches between town visits. The sun was setting by the time they finished at the store. Silas arranged to have their purchases delivered to the hotel, then escorted Eleanor to the building's small dining room. Lamplight gleamed on the few occupied tables, creating pools of warm yellow in the growing dusk. They were seated in a quiet corner away from the other diners' curious glances. Eleanor studied the rough wooden table, uncertain how to begin. She jumped slightly when Silas cleared his throat. Reckon we should talk some, he said, his voice low, about what you'll be facing if you go through with this. Eleanor met his gaze. Tell me about your home, Mr. Boone. Silas, he corrected gently. It's nothing fancy. Cabin's solid, though. Built it myself. 2 rooms and a lean-to for storage. Got a good spring nearby, never runs dry. Land's mostly wooded, being up in the hills. He paused as the server brought their meals, simple fare of beef stew and fresh bread. When they were alone again, he continued. Make my living from timber mostly, got arrangements with the sawmill in the next valley. It's hard work, but it pays fair. His scarred face tightened slightly. Won't be like town life. Nearest neighbor's 3 miles away. Winters can be harsh. Eleanor broke off a piece of bread, considering his words. I'm not afraid of hard work. Or solitude. No, he said thoughtfully. Reckon you're not. He stirred his stew. Still, it's only right you know what you're choosing. Eleanor set down her spoon, gathering her courage. I never thought any man would choose me. When my letters went unanswered, or the responses stopped once I sent my photograph, she swallowed hard. I'd almost given up hope. Silas's blue eyes narrowed. Then them men were fools. His voice was gruff, but sincere. I need a partner, Miss Hayes. Someone strong enough for mountain life. Someone with sense and skill. His mouth quirked slightly. Never did see the appeal of them delicate city ladies, fragile as porcelain dolls. Eleanor felt warmth bloom in her chest, different from any embarrassment she'd known. I can cook, she offered. And sew. I helped raise my younger siblings after Ma passed. Silas nodded. Noticed your practical questions in your letters about crop storage and preserving food, about medical supplies and repairs. He took a slow breath. You weren't just looking for a husband, you were looking to build a life. Yes, Eleanor whispered. For the first time, she felt truly seen. They finished their meal in comfortable silence. When the dishes were cleared, Silas rose. I've arranged a room for you here tonight, he said. Proper thing to do since we're not wed yet. I'll bed down in the stable with the horses. You don't have to, Eleanor began. I do. His voice was firm but kind. We'll head north at first light, if you're still willing. It's a fair journey to the homestead. Eleanor nodded, touched by his consideration. I'll be ready. Get some rest then. He hesitated, then added quietly, I meant what I said at the station, Miss Hayes. You're perfect for what I need. Don't let nobody tell you different. With a slight bow, he turned and strode from the dining room, leaving Eleanor sitting in the lamplight. She touched the wrapped peppermint stick in her pocket, Sarah's small kindness, and felt hope unfurling like spring leaves in her heart. Tomorrow would begin her new life up in the mountain hills with this quiet man who looked past surfaces to see her true worth. The dining room slowly emptied as other patrons finished their meals. Eleanor remained a moment longer, watching the lamp flames dance. Outside the window, stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the stable, Silas was settling down for the night, proving through actions rather than words that his intentions were honorable. Tomorrow they would begin the journey to his home. Their home, if all went well. She finally rose, careful of the creaking chair, and made her way upstairs to her room. The bed was narrow but clean, the quilt faded but warm. As she prepared for sleep, Eleanor thought of Sarah's welcoming smile, of Silas's steady presence, of the promise of belonging after so many years of loneliness. Perhaps here, in this frontier town beneath the mountains, she would finally find her place. Dawn painted the sky in soft brushstrokes of pink and gold as Eleanor made her way down the hotel's narrow stairs. Her simple brown traveling dress rustled with each careful step. The aroma of fresh coffee and cooking ham drew her toward the kitchen where the hotel's cook had prepared an early breakfast as arranged by Silas. She found him already at a corner table, his broad shoulders hunched over a steaming cup. He stood when she approached, pulling out her chair with unexpected grace for such large, work-roughened hands. Morning, Miss Hayes, he said quietly. Sleep well? Yes, thank you. Eleanor settled herself carefully on the sturdy chair, though I confessed to some nervousness about the journey ahead. The cook brought out loaded plates, thick slices of ham, and golden biscuit still warm from the oven. Eleanor's stomach rumbled at the sight, reminding her that she'd eaten little at yesterday's supper, too anxious about what lay ahead. Eat hearty, Silas encouraged, passing the butter. It's a fair distance to my place, and the road ain't always smooth. They ate in companionable silence as the sun climbed higher. Through the window, Eleanor could see Silas's wagon already loaded with their supplies from yesterday, plus her trunk strapped securely at the back. Two strong horses stomped impatiently in their traces, their breath making clouds in the cool morning air. When the last biscuit had been finished and the coffee cups drained, Silas rose. Best get started while the day's young. Outside, the street was quiet save for a few early risers heading to work. Eleanor approached the wagon with determination, though her heart fluttered at the challenge ahead. The step up was high, and she knew her size would make mounting awkward. Silas didn't hesitate. He positioned himself beside her, offering his arm. "Here now. Let me help." Eleanor gripped his forearm, surprised by the solid strength she felt beneath his sleeve. With his support, she managed to haul herself up onto the wooden seat, though her cheeks burned with the effort. The wagon creaked but held steady. Silas checked the horses one final time, then swung up beside her with practiced ease. He gathered the reins, clicking softly to the team. "Ready?" Eleanor nodded, clutching her shawl closer against the morning chill. The wagon lurched forward, wheels crunching on the packed dirt of the street. As they passed the general store, she glimpsed Sarah in the window and raised her hand in farewell. The girl waved back, her smile bright in the early light. The sun gilded the distant mountains as they left the town behind, the road stretching ahead like a dusty ribbon. Eleanor watched the landscape change, buildings giving way to scattered homesteads, then to open country dotted with pine trees that grew thicker as they continued north. The wagon moved slowly, heavy with supplies. Every bump and rut transmitted through the wooden seat, but Silas handled the reins with careful skill, avoiding the worst spots where he could. Still, Eleanor found herself gripping the seat edge more than once. "You're doing fine," Silas said after a particularly jarring section. Most city folks would be complaining by now. Eleanor managed a small laugh. "My mother taught me better than that." She hesitated, then added, "She was a seamstress, worked long hours to keep food on our table after Pa died. Never heard her complain once, no matter how tired she was." Silas nodded thoughtfully. "Sounds like a strong woman." "She was." Eleanor smoothed her skirt, remembering. "Taught me everything I know about making do and making things last. How to turn old clothes into new ones, how to patch and mend so the work would hold." She smiled softly. "But mostly she taught me that hard times don't last forever if you just keep going." "Wise words," Silas said. He glanced at her. "That where you learned your sewing skills?" "Yes, I helped in her shop from the time I could hold a needle. Later, I took in work of my own." She twisted her hands in her lap. "I always dreamed of having my own home, though. Somewhere filled with warmth and laughter like we had before Pa died." Silas was quiet for a long moment, just the creak of leather and jingle of harness between them. "Been a while since there was any laughter in my cabin," he finally said. "Might be nice to hear it again." The sun climbed higher as they traveled, the air warming around them. Near midday, Silas guided the wagon off the main road toward a small stream that burbled over rocks in a shady grove. "Good spot to rest the horses," he explained, setting the brake. "And ourselves." He helped Eleanor down, then unhitched the team so they could drink from the clear water. From the wagon, he pulled out a simple lunch: bread, jerky, and apples. They sat on a fallen log in the dappled shade, the horses cropping grass nearby. "Have to admit," Silas said, tearing off a piece of jerky, "I half expected you to change your mind this morning." Eleanor looked at him in surprise. "Why?" He shrugged, his scarred face troubled. "Most would. Life up here ain't easy. Winters are long, summers are full of work. Town's far enough that visits are rare." He picked at a piece of bark. "Gets lonely sometimes." "I know about lonely," Eleanor said softly. "About being different, being stared at, being judged." She straightened her shoulders. "At least up here the mountains won't laugh." Silas's mouth twitched. "No, they won't at that," he glanced at her. "Though they might grumble now and then, especially when it storms." Eleanor found herself chuckling at his unexpected humor. "I'll try not to take it personally." His answering smile, though brief, transformed his weathered face. They finished their meal in comfortable silence, listening to the stream's gentle song. The afternoon passed slowly as they continued their journey. The road grew rougher as they climbed, the pines pressing closer. Eleanor found herself relaxing despite the jolts and swaying, lulled by the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves, and Silas's quiet presence beside her. As the sun began to sink, Silas guided them to a sheltered clearing beneath towering pines. "We'll camp here tonight," he said. "Should reach home by tomorrow afternoon." He helped Eleanor down, then began setting up camp with practiced efficiency. Soon, a small fire blazed, and the horses were tended to. Eleanor unpacked cooking supplies from the wagon, determined to prove her worth. I can make us a proper supper, she offered. There's still plenty of daylight. Silas paused in arranging his bedroll near the fire. You don't have to. I want to, she said firmly. Besides, we both need a hot meal after today's travel. He nodded slowly. All right then, what can I do to help? Together they assembled the makings of a simple stew: salt pork, dried vegetables, and a handful of potatoes from their supplies. Eleanor worked with quiet confidence, seasoning the pot with herbs she'd brought from Missouri. As darkness gathered, the aroma of cooking food filled the clearing. Silas returned from checking the horses to find Eleanor stirring the pot, humming softly to herself. Smells mighty fine, he said, settling on a log nearby. Almost ready, she replied. I hope you like it. It's not fancy, but it's filling. When she handed him a tin plate full of steaming stew, his eyes widened at the first taste. This is good, he said with surprise. Real good. Eleanor felt warmth bloom in her chest at his obvious appreciation. Mother always said food tastes better when it's shared. Your mother was right about a lot of things, seems like. Silas scraped his plate clean, then helped himself to seconds. Been a long time since I had a proper home-cooked meal. Years of my own cooking. He shook his head. Let's just say it ain't quite the same. Night settled around them like a soft blanket, the fire casting dancing shadows on the pine trunks. Crickets began their evening chorus, a peaceful backdrop to the occasional pop and crackle of burning wood. You should take the wagon tonight, Silas said as they cleaned up after supper. I'll sleep by the fire, more comfortable than the ground for you. Eleanor wanted to protest, but recognized the wisdom in his words. She was already stiff from the day's travel. Thank you. He helped her arrange her bedding in the wagon bed, then returned to his own blankets by the fire. Eleanor lay awake for a while, watching stars peek through the pine branches overhead. The night was alive with small sounds, crickets chirping, an owl's distant call, the horses shuffling in their picket line. From her position in the wagon, she could see Silas's outline by the fire, solid and reassuring. His quiet consideration throughout the day had touched her deeply. Perhaps here, with this man who looked past surfaces to see worth beneath, she might find the home she'd always dreamed of. The thought followed her into sleep, accompanied by the gentle symphony of the forest night. The afternoon sun slanted through the pines as Silas's wagon finally crested the last rise. Eleanor, weary from 2 days of travel, straightened on the hard seat as a small valley opened before them. Her eyes widened at the sight below. A sturdy log cabin stood in a natural clearing, smoke curling lazily from its stone chimney. Behind it, tall pines marched up the mountainside, their trunks straight and strong. To one side, a fenced pen held several goats that raised their heads at the wagon's approach. Neat stacks of cut timber waited near a simple barn, ready for hauling to town. It ain't much, Silas said gruffly, but it's home. Eleanor's heart quickened after years of dreaming, after the endless lonely nights in her mother's cramped apartment above the shop, after yesterday's humiliation at the stage depot. Here was a real home, waiting for her touch. It's wonderful, she breathed, meaning it. Silas's hands tightened on the reins, then relaxed. He guided the tired horses down the slope, the wagon creaking as it followed the well-worn track. As they drew closer, Eleanor noticed more details. A patch of turned earth that must be a vegetable garden, though autumn bare now, a splitting stump with an axe buried in its side, a rack of drying herbs under the cabin's eave. The wagon rolled to a stop before the cabin's door. Before Silas could climb down, Eleanor heard a splash and looked toward the sound. Not 20 yards from the cabin, clear water bubbled up from the ground, forming a small pool before running off down the valley in a merry stream. That's the spring, Silas explained, helping her down from the wagon. Never known it to run dry, even in the worst drought. Sweet water, too. You won't find better. Eleanor nodded, already calculating how convenient it would be for cooking and washing. She followed Silas to the cabin door, noting how the rough-hewn logs were skillfully fitted, the chinking tight between them. He'd built this place to last. Silas hesitated at the threshold, then pushed the door open. I should have, he started, then fell silent as Eleanor stepped inside. The cabin's interior was simple, almost Spartan. A pot-bellied wood stove squatted in one corner, its pipe rising through the roof. A solid table and 2 chairs stood beneath the window, while a narrow bunk with a straw tick mattress lined one wall. Shelves held tools, a few battered pots, and some provisions. Everything was clean, if plain, speaking of a man who lived alone and saw no need for extras. Eleanor set her trunk down carefully. Without a word, she untied her bonnet and rolled up her sleeves. Spotting a broom in the corner, she grabbed it and began sweeping, starting with the pine needles that had blown in through the open door. "You don't have to," Silas protested. "Nonsense," Eleanor said firmly. "This is my home now too, isn't it?" She paused in her sweeping to smile at him. "And I aim to make it a proper one." A complicated expression crossed Silas's scarred face, part shame at the cabin's plainness, part wonder at her ready acceptance, and part something deeper that made his eyes shine briefly before he looked away. "I'll see to the horses," he mumbled and ducked outside. Eleanor continued her cleaning, humming softly as she worked. The cabin was well built, if basic. Good bones, her mother would have said. It just needed a woman's touch to make it truly livable. She opened her trunk and pulled out several pieces of fabric she'd brought, already planning curtains for the windows. The glass panes were clean but bare, and the afternoon sun streamed in harshly. Some cheerful cotton print would soften the light and make the room more welcoming. By the time Silas returned, she had swept the entire cabin, arranged her few belongings neatly, and was measuring the windows with a length of string. He stood in the doorway watching her, his expression unreadable. "I hope you don't mind," she said, suddenly uncertain. "I thought some curtains might be nice." "No, I don't mind." His voice was rough. "Been a long time since anyone tried to make this place pretty." Eleanor's hand stilled on the string. "Your first wife," she began carefully. "Sarah." He moved to the stove, checking its damper with careful attention. "She died before we built this cabin. The fever took her, back when we were still in the valley settlement." He straightened, not looking at Eleanor. "That was 6 years ago." "I'm sorry," Eleanor said softly. The words seemed inadequate, but they were all she had. Silas nodded once sharply. "Supper," he said. "You must be hungry after the journey." Together they prepared a simple meal. Eleanor found cornmeal and bacon in the stores, and soon had cornbread baking in the cast-iron spider, while Silas fried the meat. The familiar tasks eased the moment's tension, and by the time they sat down to eat, the awkwardness had passed. Lamplight gleamed on tin plates as they shared the hot cornbread and bacon. Eleanor had added the last of their traveling apples, sliced thin as a treat. The food was plain but filling, and she took quiet pleasure in seeing Silas clean his plate. After the meal, while Silas banked the stove's fire for the night, Eleanor returned to her sewing. She had to work quickly to finish before full dark, but her fingers were sure on the familiar task. Her mother had taught her well, and soon the first curtain hung in place, its blue and white pattern catching the last rays of sunset. "There," she said with satisfaction, "that's better already. I'll do the other window tomorrow if that's all right." Silas stood in the cabin's center, staring at the curtain as if he'd never seen such a thing before. In the lamplight, his expression was soft with wonder. "Been so long since anyone," he started, then shook his head. "Yes, that's all right." Eleanor settled in the chair by the stove, drawing out her small sewing kit. As she threaded a needle to hem the second curtain, she began humming softly, an old hymn her mother had loved. The familiar tune filled the cabin's shadows with comfort as her needle flashed in the lamplight. Silas sat in the other chair, just watching her work. The silence between them was peaceful, broken only by the hymn's gentle notes and the pop of burning wood in the stove. Outside, a whip-poor-will called, and far off a coyote answered. When the light grew too dim to sew by, Eleanor carefully packed away her needle and thread. Silas had already arranged clean blankets on the narrow bunk for her, making his own bed on the floor near the stove. "I can't take your bed," Eleanor protested. "You ain't taking it, I'm giving it to you," Silas said firmly. "We'll sort out proper sleeping arrangements tomorrow. For tonight, you need real rest after 2 days on the road." Too tired to argue, Eleanor changed behind the privacy of a blanket hung from a rafter. The bunk was narrow but comfortable enough, the straw tick fresh and sweet-smelling. Silas banked the fire one final time, then blew out the lamp. In the darkness, Eleanor lay awake for a long while, listening to the night sounds of her new home. The cabin creaked softly as it cooled. Wind sighed in the pines outside. From his blankets by the stove, Silas's breathing grew slow and steady. She thought of the stage depot just 2 days ago, when she'd been ready to flee back to Missouri in shame. Instead, here she was, in a mountain cabin with a man who seemed to value her practical nature and didn't flinch at her size. A man who'd given her his bed without hesitation and hung a blanket for her privacy without being asked. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt truly at peace. This wasn't the life she'd imagined as a girl, but perhaps it was the life she was meant to have. A place where she could belong, where her skills were needed and her presence welcomed. She drifted off to sleep with the taste of hope in her heart, sweet as spring water. 2 days after their arrival at the cabin, morning sunlight streamed through Eleanor's new curtains, casting blue and white patterns across the swept floor. She stood at the wood stove, carefully wrapping the last of yesterday's cornbread in a clean cloth. The cabin already showed signs of her presence: herbs drying from rafters, organized shelves, and a fresh tablecloth she'd sewn from spare fabric. Silas ducked through the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame. "Wagon's ready. Sure you want to come to town?" His voice held concern. "I can manage the supplies alone." Eleanor squared her shoulders, though her heart fluttered. A wife should help with such things. Besides, we need proper flour for bread making, and I'd rather choose it myself. He nodded slowly, respect flickering in his eyes. "Reckon you're right, but if anyone—" He left the warning unspoken. "I've weathered worse than whispers," Eleanor said firmly, though her hands trembled as she tied her bonnet strings. She'd spent 2 peaceful days in this valley, almost forgetting how the world saw her. But they needed supplies, and she refused to hide forever. The wagon creaked as Eleanor settled onto the wooden seat. Silas had added an extra cushion, and she felt a warm surge of gratitude for his thoughtfulness. The morning air was crisp, hinting at the coming winter, and fallen leaves crunched under the wagon wheels as they started down the mountain trail. During the journey, Eleanor kept her eyes on the scenery, memorizing landmarks. A lightning-struck pine marked where the trail forked. A peculiar boulder shaped like a sleeping bear showed they were halfway. She was determined to learn every inch of her new home. The town appeared suddenly around a bend, its handful of buildings stark against the prairie. Eleanor's throat tightened as they approached the general store. Several townsfolk loitered on the boardwalk, their conversations dying as the wagon drew near. Silas jumped down first, offering his hand. Eleanor took it, descending as gracefully as she could manage. The wooden steps creaked beneath her weight, drawing snickers from 2 young men lounging against a post. She lifted her chin and walked straight into the store, refusing to acknowledge them. Inside, the shopkeeper's daughter, Mary, Eleanor remembered, offered a shy smile. "Welcome back, Mrs. Boone. Pa just gotten fresh flour yesterday." The simple courtesy nearly brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. She busied herself examining the flour barrels while Silas gathered other supplies: coffee, salt, ammunition, and new axe handles. The bell above the door jangled. Mr. Alcott sauntered in, his fine coat and polished boots marking him as the town's banker. His thin lips curved in a cruel smile as he spotted Eleanor. "Well, well, if it isn't our mountain man and his insubstantial bride." Alcott's voice dripped with mockery. "Tell me, Boone, how long before she eats you out of house and land? Might want to consider a loan to keep up with the provisions." Eleanor's cheeks burned. She gripped the edge of a barrel, willing herself not to cry. The store had gone deadly quiet. Silas straightened slowly from where he'd been examining tools. His scarred face was stone hard as he turned. "Shut your mouth, Alcott," he said softly, dangerously. "Just offering friendly financial advice," Alcott smirked. "Though I suppose with her size you won't need a draft horse for logging anymore." The heavy thud of coins hitting the counter cut him off. Silas had slammed down payment for their supplies, his eyes never leaving Alcott's face. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "would you help Mary gather our things?" Eleanor moved quickly to collect their purchases, her hands shaking but her movements deliberate. Mary helped her, shooting angry glances at Alcott. The banker took a step back from Silas's steady gaze. "No need to get riled, Boone. Just making conversation." He adjusted his coat with affected casualness. "Good day to you both." He retreated through the door. though his mocking laugh drifted back inside. Eleanor was wrapping the last package when the door opened again. This time it was Reverend Matthews, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday coat. He cleared his throat twice before speaking. "Mrs. Boone," he said carefully, we would like to welcome you to our community." He glanced at his feet, clearly thinking of his wife's cruel words at the stage depot. "We hope you'll join us for services soon." Eleanor managed a small nod, not trusting her voice. The pastor hurried out, duty discharged. The wagon ride home was quiet. Eleanor stared straight ahead, fighting tears until they were well out of town. Finally, on a lonely stretch of trail, she buried her face in her hands and wept. "Don't waste tears on fools," Silas said gruffly, but his hand found hers, rough fingers squeezing gently. "You're worth more than the lot of them." Eleanor wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to be weak." "Weak?" Silas snorted. "You walked into that store head high, didn't run when Alcott started his poison. That ain't weak, Eleanor. That's courage." She managed a watery smile. "Thank you for defending me." "You're my wife," he said simply, then after a pause, "Should have broken his jaw, though." That startled a laugh from Eleanor. Violence wouldn't help, besides Mary was kind, and the pastor tried at least. Silas grunted. "Suppose so, still wouldn't mind seeing Alcott take a tumble in the horse trough." The image lightened Eleanor's heart enough that by the time they reached the cabin, her tears had dried. She immediately set to putting away their supplies, then began mixing dough for bread. The familiar motions soothed her, measuring flour, adding yeast, kneading the soft mass with practiced hands. As the bread rose, filling the cabin with its yeasty smell, Eleanor thought about the day's events. The mockery had hurt, yes, but she'd survived it. She had a home now, and a husband who defended her honor. It was more than she dared hope for just days ago. When the loaves were golden brown and fragrant, Eleanor called Silas to supper. She'd made a simple stew to go with the fresh bread, setting everything out on her clean tablecloth. Before they ate, she bowed her head as she always did. To her surprise, Silas reached across the table and took her hand. His voice was rough, halting, as if remembering long, unused words. "Lord," he said slowly, "thank you for this food, for this home, for—" He squeezed Eleanor's fingers. "For sending me a wife with courage and kindness. Help me be worthy of her. Amen." Eleanor's heart swelled. She squeezed his hand back, understanding what it cost this proud, wounded man to pray aloud again. They ate their supper in comfortable silence, the bread warm and perfect, while outside their mountain valley grew dark and peaceful under the rising stars. Later, as Eleanor washed the dishes, she found herself humming her mother's favorite hymn. Silas sat in his chair by the fire, whittling a piece of pine. The cabin was warm, fragrant with bread and wood smoke, and Eleanor felt the last of the day's hurt fade away. They were building something here, something stronger than cruel words or mocking laughter, something that might just last. The mountain air grew crisp as September mellowed into October. Eleanor settled into the rhythm of homestead life with determination that surprised even herself. Each morning, she rose before dawn, pulling on her warmest shawl to tend to the goats. At first, the cranky animals had butted her hands away, unused to new faces, but Eleanor's patience won them over, especially after she started bringing treats of dried apple pieces. Now they crowded around her, bleating demandingly as she positioned her milking stool. "There now, Martha," she cooed to the oldest nanny goat, running gentle hands down her sides. "Just hold still for me." The warm milk pinged steadily into the tin pail, a sound that reminded Eleanor of peaceful mornings at her mother's house. Inside the cabin, she strained the milk through clean muslin, setting some aside for cheesemaking. The rest went into the morning's coffee and porridge. When Silas came in from checking his trap lines, breakfast was waiting. Hot, filling, and made with care. "Much obliged," he'd say gruffly, but his eyes were warm as he watched her bustle about the cabin. Eleanor had organized his sparse belongings, mended the worn curtains, and added cheerful touches that made the rough-hewn space feel like home. One evening, Silas returned from logging with his heavy wool coat torn badly across the shoulder. "Caught it on a branch," he explained, shrugging out of the garment. Eleanor clicked her tongue sympathetically. Let me see to that. She retrieved her sewing basket, selecting strong thread that matched the coat's dark fabric. Her fingers, though large, moved with surprising delicacy as she created neat, even stitches. Silas watched her work in the lamplight. You've got clever hands, he observed. Mama taught me well, Eleanor replied, tying off the final knot. A seamstress's daughter learns early that mending keeps body and soul together. She held up the coat, the repair nearly invisible. There now, good as new. The next day, Silas surprised her by leading his old mule, Betsy, to the cabin door. Time you learned to ride, he announced. Can't have you walking everywhere in these hills. Eleanor eyed the animal dubiously. I don't know, Silas, I'm awful heavy for that poor creature. Nonsense, Betsy's stronger than she looks, used to haul timber before she got too old for it. Come on now. It took both of them, with much pulling and pushing, to get Eleanor settled in the saddle. The mule shifted, adjusting to the weight, but stood steady. Eleanor clutched the pommel, terrified of falling. Just relax, Silas instructed. Move with her motion like dancing. Dancing, Eleanor exclaimed. I haven't danced since I was a girl. But she tried to follow his advice as he led Betsy in a slow circle. The mule's ears flicked back and forth as if confused by this new arrangement. When she stopped suddenly to scratch her nose with a back hoof, Eleanor lurched forward with a squeak of alarm. The look of indignant surprise on her face was so comical that Silas burst out laughing. His deep chuckles startled Eleanor. She'd never heard him laugh before. The sound was infectious. Soon she was laughing too, tears streaming down her cheeks as she clung to the saddle. Their mirth echoed off the cabin walls, startling a flock of jays into flight. Oh my, Eleanor wheezed, wiping her eyes. I must look a sight. You look fine, Silas said, still grinning. Like you belong there. After that, Eleanor practiced riding every day, gaining confidence. Betsy proved a patient teacher, though she still stopped to scratch at the most inconvenient moments. Sundays became special times in the cabin. Eleanor insisted on observing the Sabbath, not with stern rules, but with joy. She'd sing hymns in her rich contralto voice while kneading bread or stirring stew. Soon, Silas found himself humming along, remembering tunes from his own childhood. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, Eleanor sang, her voice filling their home with warmth. That saved a wretch like me. Silas joined in softly on the next line, and Eleanor's face lit up with pleasure. The simple harmonies seemed to make the cabin glow from within. It was on one such Sunday that they first heard a knock at their door. Eleanor opened it to find a tall Arapaho woman standing quietly on their step. Her dark eyes were dignified, her bearing proud, despite worn clothing. I am Nita, she said in careful English. I trade herbs, medicines. She held up a bundle of dried plants. Good for winter coughs, fever. Eleanor smiled warmly. Please come in, I'm Eleanor Boone, and this is my husband Silas. Nita hesitated only briefly before entering. Her sharp eyes took in the neat cabin, the bubbling stew pot, the fresh-baked bread cooling on the table. Share our dinner, Eleanor invited, and there's plenty. Again that slight pause, then a nod. Thank you, I bring these. Nita produced a pouch of dried berries from her shawl. Sweet with tea. They ate together, conversation gradually warming as the meal progressed. Nita explained the uses of different herbs, which for headache, which for stomach pain, which to help with sleep. Eleanor listened intently, asking careful questions. Would you teach me more, she asked, about the healing plants? Nita studied her thoughtfully. Yes, it's good to share knowledge. Next time I bring more herbs, show you how to make teas. After the meal, Eleanor disappeared briefly into her bedroom. She returned with a carefully pieced quilt square, all blues and greens like mountain shadows. For you, she said, pressing it into Nita's hands. To say thank you for the berries and learning. Nita ran her fingers over the neat stitching. Is beautiful work, she said softly. I come again next week? Please do, Eleanor replied. After Nita left, Silas shook his head in wonder. Most folks hereabouts won't give Indians the time of day, he observed, but you treated her like an honored guest. Eleanor looked thoughtful as she cleared the dishes. People are people, Silas. Mama always said kindness costs nothing but means everything. She smiled. Besides, I like her. She has honest eyes. True to her word, Nita returned the following week with more herbs and knowledge to share. She taught Eleanor which barks and roots to gather before winter, how to dry them properly, how to brew them for maximum benefit. In return, Eleanor shared baking secrets and sewing techniques. Their friendship grew naturally, bridging the gap between their different worlds. Soon, Nita was bringing her 2 sons along sometimes, shy boys who gradually warmed to Eleanor's gentle ways and Silas's whittled toys. As October waned, Eleanor turned her attention to winter preparations. She had learned from her mother never to waste nature's bounty. Root vegetables were carefully stored in the cool cellar Silas had dug beneath the cabin. Apples were dried, berries preserved, meat smoked. She spent days putting up preserves, jars of gleaming jellies and jams that caught the autumn light. The cabin filled with sweet steam and the ping of ceiling lids as she worked. Even Silas admitted the preserves would be welcome when snow locked them in. "Never thought to see this place so organized," he commented one evening, watching Eleanor check her neat rows of jars. "You've worked magic here." Eleanor blushed at the praise. "He's just doing what needs doing." But her heart warmed at his words. Indeed, the cabin had transformed under her care. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters. Homespun curtains softened the windows. The rough table bore a cheerful cloth, and savory smells regularly wafted from the cookstove. Even the goats were sleeker and more productive under her attention. More than the physical changes, though, was the shift in atmosphere. The lonely bachelor cabin had become a home, filled with warmth and purpose. Silas found himself hurrying back from his work, knowing Eleanor would be there with hot coffee and willing ears for his day's tales. He watched with growing pride as she mastered new skills, riding Betsy with increasing confidence, learning Nita's herbal lore, managing their small homestead with capable hands. Her size, which had drawn such cruel mockery in town, seemed to matter less with each passing day. What mattered was her gentle strength, her quick laugh, her generous heart. As the aspen leaves turned golden and the first snow dusted the high peaks, Eleanor stood in their doorway one evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains pink. The air held winter's bite, but inside the cabin was warm and fragrant with baking bread. "Penny for your thoughts?" Silas asked, joining her. Eleanor smiled, contentment clear on her face. "Just thinking how blessed we are. We have food stored up, a snug roof, good neighbors like Nita." She patted his arm. "And each other." Silas covered her hand with his own, rough fingers gentle on her skin. No words were needed as they watched night settle over their mountain home. They had found something precious here: acceptance, purpose, and a love that grew stronger with each passing day. The evening star appeared above the peaks, bright and steady. Inside, the fire crackled welcomingly, and Eleanor's latest batch of bread filled the air with its homey scent. Life wasn't perfect, but it was good. Very good indeed. The morning air held autumn's crisp bite as Eleanor hummed while feeding the goats. Frost sparkled on fallen leaves, and her breath made little clouds in the cold. The animals pressed close, eager for the fresh hay she scattered. Their warm bodies and gentle bleating always brought her comfort. But today, her thoughts kept drifting to Silas. He'd left before dawn to haul timber down to the railway depot, promising to return by midday. The work was hard, yet he never complained. His quiet strength and dedication made her heart swell with pride. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Eleanor pause. It wasn't Silas, too early, and just one horse rather than his team. She shielded her eyes against the morning sun, watching a smartly dressed man ride up their narrow trail. Her stomach clenched as she recognized him, one of Mr. Alcott's bankmen, Thompson. He dismounted with a flourish, brushing dust from his fine coat. "Mrs. Boone," he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Might we speak inside?" Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she latched the goat pen. "My husband isn't here right now," she said, keeping her voice steady. "This won't take long." Thompson's smile didn't reach his eyes. Just a friendly reminder about certain financial obligations. Inside the cabin, Eleanor refused to sit. She stood by the cookstove, drawing strength from its solid presence while Thompson delivered his message. "Mr. Alcott wants the full amount by month's end," he said, examining his fingernails. "Otherwise, foreclosure proceedings will begin. Nothing personal, you understand. Just business. The payment's not due for another 3 months, Eleanor protested. Thompson's smile turned cold. Terms have changed. Mr. Alcott's been very patient, but he needs this matter settled quickly. He placed a formal-looking document on the table. Notice of accelerated payment. Good day, Mrs. Boone. The cabin felt colder after he left. Eleanor's hands shook as she picked up the paper, reading the harsh legal terms through blurring eyes. The amount listed made her gasp, far more than she'd imagined. She tried to keep busy, but worry gnawed at her. When Silas finally returned, his heavy tread on the porch, she could barely meet his eyes. Eleanor? He saw her pale face and stopped short. What's wrong? She wordlessly handed him the notice. Silas read it, his face growing darker with each line. Finally, he slumped into a chair, the paper crumpling in his fist. I should have told you before, he said heavily, about the loans. Eleanor pulled up another chair, sitting close enough that their knees touched. Tell me now. As the afternoon light faded, Silas explained everything. How he'd borrowed heavily to buy timber rights when prices were good. How Alcott had seemed eager to help, offering generous terms. But now the banker wanted the land, specifically the spring that never ran dry. Railroad's planning a spur line, Silas said bitterly. Alcott aims to control the water rights, charge what he pleases for access. He looked down at his calloused hands. I've been a fool. Eleanor reached out, covering his rough fingers with her own. Number, you're a man trying to build something worthwhile. She squeezed his hand. And you're not alone anymore. We'll face this together. Silas's voice was rough with emotion. You didn't sign up for this trouble when you came here. I signed up for better or worse, Eleanor reminded him firmly. This is just the worst part. The better will come. That evening, after a simple supper neither could really eat, Eleanor decided to tackle the cabin's small storage room. Work would keep her mind from worry, and they might find something to sell. The room held boxes of old papers and tools carefully preserved despite their age. Eleanor started sorting through them, organizing what might be useful. In a dusty corner, her hand touched something leather. She pulled out a battered satchel, its straps cracked with age. Silas? She called. Do you know what this is? He looked up from mending a harness. Pa's old papers, I reckon. Never had the heart to go through them after he passed. Eleanor carefully opened the satchel. Inside lay bundles of documents tied with faded ribbon. She began reading through them, squinting in the lamplight at the spidery handwriting. Suddenly, she gasped, Silas, come look at this. He crossed the room as Eleanor spread several papers on the table. They were legal documents, dated nearly 30 years earlier, and signed by territorial officials. They detailed water rights to the spring, the original claim, properly witnessed but never fully registered with the county. Your father filed these claims, Eleanor said excitedly. Look, his signature and 2 witnesses. They prove he was first to claim the spring's water rights. Silas frowned, studying the yellowed pages, but they weren't registered proper. Law won't likely honor them now. Why not? Eleanor demanded. The territorial officials signed them. That was legal authority back then. She traced the formal signatures with a gentle finger. These are real, Silas. They could stop Alcott's scheme. Eleanor, Silas's voice held doubt. It's not that simple. Nothing worth fighting forever is, she countered. But these papers matter. They show your father's claim came first. She gathered the documents carefully. At the very least, they'll delay any foreclosure while the court sorts it out. Silas ran a hand through his graying hair. Alcott's got money for fancy lawyers. We've got nothing but old papers. We've got truth on our side, Eleanor insisted, and right and each other. She touched his arm gently. Don't give up before we've even tried. In the lamplight, she saw the struggle in his face. Hope warring with bitter experience, pride with practicality. She waited, letting him work through it in his own time. Finally, Silas straightened his shoulders. You really think these might help? I do, Eleanor said firmly. Your father was a careful man. He wouldn't have kept these papers all these years if they weren't important. She began gathering the documents, smoothing their creased corners. Tomorrow we'll take them to town, find someone who knows the law proper. Silas watched her work, something like wonder crossing his weathered face. When did you get so wise?" Eleanor smiled, though her hands trembled slightly as she tied the papers together. "Not wisdom, just stubbornness. Mama always said I was too stubborn to fail." She met his eyes steadily. "We won't fail, Silas. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." The lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, an owl called softly in the gathering dark. Eleanor carefully placed the precious documents back in the leather satchel, already planning their next steps. They had found hope in dusty papers and faded ink. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, that hope was enough. Eleanor reached for Silas's hand, and his strong fingers clasped hers tightly. Whatever came next, they would meet it side by side. Dawn broke crisp and clear as Eleanor and Silas prepared for their journey. The leather satchel with its precious papers lay carefully wrapped in oilcloth, tucked safely in Eleanor's traveling basket. She'd risen early to pack bread, cheese, and dried apples for the trip, knowing they couldn't spare money for fancy meals. Silas hitched their team to the wagon, checking each buckle with extra care. The mountain trail to the county seat was rough, and they couldn't risk any accidents. Eleanor watched him work, noting how his shoulders seemed straighter today, as if hope had given him new strength. "Ready?" he asked, offering his hand to help her up to the wagon seat. Eleanor nodded, settling her skirts around her. The wooden seat creaked under her weight, but she'd learned not to flinch at such sounds anymore. Silas had reinforced all his furniture without a word, making sure everything was sturdy enough for her comfort. They set out as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, the wagon wheels crunching through early frost. The air held that special mountain clarity that made distant ridges seem close enough to touch. Eleanor breathed deeply, savoring the pine-scented breeze. "It's a good 2 days to the county seat," Silas said, clicking to the horses. "Longer if the creek's running high at the ford." "Then we'll have plenty of time to study these papers," Eleanor replied, patting her basket. "We need to know them inside and out before we face any officials." The trail wound down through stands of aspen, their leaves flickering gold in the morning light. Eleanor found herself humming hymns as they traveled, old songs her mother had taught her. Occasionally, Silas would join in, his deep voice harmonizing on familiar choruses. They stopped at midday to rest the horses and share a simple meal. Eleanor spread their food on a clean cloth while Silas tended to the team. The autumn sun felt warm on their faces as they ate, though shadows held a hint of winter's chill. "Tell me something about when you were young," Eleanor said, breaking the comfortable silence. "What did you dream of becoming?" Silas looked surprised at the question. He chewed thoughtfully on a piece of bread before answering. "Might sound foolish now, but I wanted to be a preacher." "A preacher?" Eleanor's eyes widened. "I never would have guessed." "Was before Sarah died," he said quietly, naming his first wife for the first time since Eleanor had known him. "Used to love studying scripture, sharing the good words with others." He shrugged, embarrassed. "Life had other plans." Eleanor touched his arm gently. "What changed your mind?" "Lost my faith for a spell after Sarah. Couldn't see the point in preaching about God's love when everything hurt so bad." He picked up a pine cone, turning it in his rough hands. "What about you? What did little Eleanor Hayes want to be?" She smiled, remembering. "A teacher. I loved books, loved helping younger children learn their letters." Her smile faded slightly. "But no one wanted someone my size teaching their children. They thought I'd scare the little ones." "Their loss," Silas said firmly. "You've got a natural way of explaining things, been teaching me plenty since you arrived." They traveled until dusk, making camp beside a small stream. While Silas gathered firewood, Eleanor set up their simple camp, spreading blankets in the wagon bed where she would sleep. Silas would bed down by the fire, proper as always. As darkness settled over the mountains, Eleanor brought out the leather satchel. They sat close to the fire, heads bent together over the documents as she read them aloud by lamplight. The papers detailed how Silas's father had discovered the spring, developed it, and filed his claim with territorial officials nearly 30 years earlier. "Listen to this," Eleanor said excitedly. said spring being necessary for the development of agriculture and timber operations in the designated township, water rights are hereby granted in perpetuity to Samuel Boone and his heirs. She looked up at Silas. In perpetuity means forever. That's you, Silas. You're his heir. If only Pa had registered these proper with the county, Silas sighed. But he did everything right according to territorial law back then, Eleanor insisted. That's what matters. The claim is valid. It just needs to be properly recorded now. They slept under a blanket of stars, the night alive with cricket song and the occasional hoot of an owl. Eleanor lay awake for a while, planning what they would say to the clerk, praying for wisdom and favor. The next morning dawned gray and cool as they broke camp and continued their journey. By mid-morning, the small county seat came into view, a cluster of wooden buildings with a proud brick courthouse at its center. Eleanor smoothed her hair and straightened her shawl, wanting to make a respectable impression. They tied the wagon in front of the courthouse and climbed the worn wooden steps together. Inside, the air smelled of dust and paper and wood polish. Their boots echoed on the plank floor as they made their way to the clerk's office. The clerk was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and wire-rimmed spectacles. He looked up from his ledger as they entered, his eyebrows rising slightly at the sight of them. The massive woman and the scarred mountain man, clearly out of place in the formal setting. "May I help you?" he asked, his tone careful but not unkind. "We need to file these water rights papers," Eleanor said, bringing out the documents. "They're original territorial claims that need proper county registration." The clerk took the papers with practiced hands, adjusting his spectacles as he began to read. His eyebrows climbed higher as he worked his way through the documents. Several times he reached for a legal volume, checking references. "These are quite old," he said finally, looking up at them. "But the territorial signatures are authentic, and the claim appears valid under the laws of the time." He drummed his fingers on his desk. "However, registering them now will require a proper hearing. There may be competing claims to consider." "We understand," Eleanor said quickly before Silas could speak. "When could such a hearing be arranged?" The clerk consulted a thick diary. 2 weeks from today, Judge Harrison will be here for his regular circuit." He began writing in his neat hand. "You'll need to leave these documents with me for official recording. I'll give you a receipt, naturally." Eleanor felt Silas tense beside her but squeezed his arm reassuringly. They had no choice but to trust the system now. The clerk carefully copied out a receipt, noting each document. 10 o'clock sharp 2 weeks from today, he said, handing them the paper. "Don't be late. Judge Harrison is a stickler for punctuality." Outside the courthouse, Silas let out a long breath. 2 weeks, he said. "Alcott's deadline is before that." "Then we'll have to make him wait," Eleanor said firmly. "He can't foreclose while there's a legal question about the water rights. We'll send him notice of the hearing date." They found a small inn at the edge of town, the kind that catered to farmers and traders rather than wealthy travelers. The room was tiny but clean, with a small cook stove where Eleanor could prepare their meals to save money. That evening, after a simple supper of beans and cornbread, they sat together in the gathering dark. The room's single lamp cast warm shadows on the walls, and distant piano music drifted up from the saloon down the street. "I don't deserve you," Silas said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. "You're fighting harder for this land than I did." Eleanor took his scarred hand in both of hers, feeling the strength and warmth of it. "You're wrong," she said softly. "You fought for me the day I stepped off that stage. When everyone else saw someone to mock, you saw someone worth claiming. You were my miracle that day, Silas Boone." He looked down at their joined hands, his dark and weathered, hers pale and soft. "Never thought I'd find hope again," he admitted. "After Sarah died, I just existed, worked the timber, paid my debts, didn't expect more." He met her eyes. "Then you came." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes but blinked them away. This wasn't a moment for crying. This was a moment for strength, for the courage they'd both need in the days ahead. "We'll win this fight," she said firmly, "together, because that's what families do. They stand by each other." Silas nodded, words failing him, but his hand tightened on hers, and in that grip was all the promise she needed. Whatever came next, the hearing, Alcott's schemes, the uncertain future, they would face it side by side, Outside their window, the stars were beginning to appear bright and steady in the mountain sky. Eleanor sent up a silent prayer of thanksgiving for this man, this place, this chance to fight for something that mattered. 2 weeks wasn't long to prepare for such an important hearing, but they had truth on their side. Sometimes, she thought, that was enough. The autumn wind whistled through the valley as Eleanor and Silas returned from the county seat. Word of their legal challenge spread quickly through the small community, carried from porch to porch like leaves on the breeze. Eleanor could feel the weight of eyes upon her whenever she ventured into town for supplies. "Did you hear?" Mrs. Peterson whispered to her friend outside the general store. "That big woman found some old papers. Says they'll save the mountain spring." "Seems mighty convenient," her companion replied, though her tone held a note of admiration. "Still, takes courage to stand up to Mr. Alcott." Others were less kind. The banker's allies, merchants who owed him money and ranchers who needed his good graces, spread ugly rumors. They claimed Eleanor had tricked Silas, that she'd somehow manufactured the documents, that she was leading a simple mountain man to ruin. When Sunday arrived, Eleanor dressed in her best dress, the dark blue one she'd carefully altered to fit. Silas put on his good shirt, though he tugged uncomfortably at the collar. The little church sat in a grove of aspens, their leaves golden in the morning light. Eleanor felt her heart quicken as they approached. This would be their first Sunday service since filing the water rights claim. The congregation fell quiet as they entered, conversation stopping mid-sentence. Eleanor held her head high, though her cheeks burned. Silas guided her to a back pew, his hand steady at her elbow. The familiar creak of the wooden bench as she settled herself seemed louder than usual in the hushed sanctuary. Pastor Matthews stood to begin the service, his Bible open before him. "Today," he announced, "we'll examine the book of Ruth." His eyes found Eleanor in the congregation. A story of loyalty, of choosing to belong, of finding grace in unexpected places. As the pastor read of Ruth's devotion to Naomi, of her courage in a strange land, Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. She remembered her own journey, the leap of faith that had brought her to this valley. Beside her, Silas reached for her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. "Ruth was a foreigner," Pastor Matthews continued, "yet she became the grandmother of kings. She found welcome among strangers, built a new life through honest work and steadfast love." Again his gaze settled on Eleanor, but this time with warmth. "God's family is larger than our narrow minds often allow." After the service, as people filed out into the crisp morning air, something unexpected happened. Martha Wilson, a widow with 3 young children, approached Eleanor shyly. "Miss Eleanor," she said softly, "I heard tell you make a fine stew." "That I do," Eleanor replied, smiling. "Would you and your little ones care to join us for supper?" Martha's eyes brightened. "We wouldn't want to impose—" "Nonsense," Eleanor said firmly. "There's always room at our table." Other faces appeared. Sarah Johnson, whose husband had died in a logging accident. The Cooper children, being raised by their aging grandmother. Young Tom Peters, whose mother was too sick to cook. One by one, they gathered around Eleanor, drawn by her warm invitation and open heart. "The more the merrier," she declared, her voice carrying across the churchyard. "We've plenty of stew and fresh bread. Come around sunset and bring your appetites." Silas watched in amazement as their quiet Sunday transformed into a gathering. Eleanor moved efficiently in their cabin's small kitchen, the big iron pot bubbling with savory stew. She had started it the day before, knowing good stew needed time to develop its flavors. Now she added more vegetables, another handful of dried herbs, making sure there would be enough for all. As the sun began to sink toward the mountains, their guests arrived. Martha Wilson's children tumbled out of her wagon, their faces freshly scrubbed. Sarah Johnson brought a jar of preserved peaches. Old Mrs. Cooper came leaning on her grandson's arm, her white hair neatly pinned beneath her bonnet. Then came a surprise. Nita appeared at the cabin door, carrying a basket of fresh-baked corn cakes. The native woman's dark eyes crinkled with warmth as Eleanor welcomed her inside. Some of the settlers looked uncertain at first, but Eleanor's easy manner soon put everyone at ease. "Nita taught me about the healing properties of sage," Eleanor explained as she served the stew, "and which berries make the best tea for winter colds." Nita smiled, passing her corn cakes around the table. Eleanor showed me new ways to piece quilts, she said in her quiet voice. We learn from each other. The cabin filled with the sounds of spoons against bowls, children's laughter, and conversation. Eleanor moved among her guests, making sure everyone had enough to eat, listening to their stories, offering comfort and advice where needed. She saw how Martha Wilson's youngest boy needed his shirt mended and made a mental note to help with that. She noticed how Sarah Johnson's hands shook slightly and resolved to send her home with extra bread. Silas sat in his corner, watching in wonder as his once silent cabin transformed into a place of welcome and warmth. Eleanor had brought more than just her presence to his life. She had brought community, connection, the very things he had forgotten he needed. As the evening deepened, Nita and Eleanor sat together near the fire, sharing stories of their grandmother's wisdom. The children played quiet games on the floor while the adults talked of weather and crops and the small events that made up their daily lives. For a few precious hours, the worries about Alcott and the water rights faded into the background. Yet trouble lurked at the edges of their peaceful gathering. Through the cabin's windows, Eleanor caught glimpses of mounted men moving in the shadows. Alcott's hired hands, watching the cabin with cold eyes. They made no move to interfere, but their presence was a clear message. The banker was not finished with them yet. Eleanor refused to let fear spoil the evening. Instead, she led everyone in singing hymns, her strong contralto voice carrying the melody, while others joined in harmony. Amazing Grace floated out into the darkening valley, a declaration of faith and resilience. As the evening wound down and families began to leave, Eleanor pressed food into their hands. Extra bread for the Wilsons, a jar of preserved vegetables for Sarah Johnson, corn cakes for Mrs. Cooper and her grandchildren. Each departure came with hugs, thanks, and promises to return. Nita was the last to leave, helping Eleanor clean up despite her protests. "You have made good medicine here?" the native woman said softly, gesturing to the cabin that still held the warmth of fellowship. "Not all healing comes from herbs." Eleanor clasped her friend's hand. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Your presence means more than you know." After everyone had gone, Eleanor and Silas stood in their doorway, looking out at the star-filled sky. The watching horsemen had melted away into the darkness, but their threat lingered like a storm on the horizon. "You've changed things," Silas said quietly. "Changed this place, changed me." Eleanor leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "We've changed things together," she corrected gently. "A home isn't just walls and a roof. It's a place where people can find welcome, where they can belong." Far off in the night, a coyote called, its lonely voice echoing through the valley. But inside the cabin, the embers of the fire glowed warm and bright, holding back the darkness. Eleanor knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them not just as husband and wife, but as part of something larger. A community bound together by love, faith, and the simple act of breaking bread together. The dishes were washed, the leftover stew safely stored, and the cabin was quiet once more. Yet it felt different now, filled with the echoes of laughter and song, of prayers and promises. Eleanor had transformed it from a mere shelter into a sanctuary, not just for herself and Silas, but for all who needed one. The morning dawned clear and cold as Eleanor carefully laid out her best calico dress on the bed. She had spent hours the night before washing and pressing it, making sure every seam lay straight. The blue and white checked fabric might not be fashionable by city standards, but it was clean, proper, and dignified, exactly what she needed for the courthouse. "You ready?" Silas called from outside where he was hitching up the wagon. "Almost," Eleanor replied, pinning her hair neatly beneath her bonnet. Her fingers trembled slightly as she secured the last pin, but her chin was held high. The documents lay safely in her carpet bag, wrapped in clean muslin. The wagon ride to the courthouse was quiet, both of them lost in thought. Eleanor watched the landscape change from mountain pines to rolling hills, then to the settled streets of the county seat. More people filled the streets today. Word had spread about the water rights hearing. As Silas helped Eleanor down from the wagon, she noticed the stares and whispers. Some folks pointed, others turned away, but she kept her shoulders square and her head high. The courthouse steps were steep, but she climbed them steadily, one at a time, Silas's strong hand at her elbow. Inside, the courthouse smelled of wood polish and dusty law books. Their footsteps echoed on the wooden floors as they made their way to the hearing room. Already, several townsfolk had gathered to watch, including some faces Eleanor recognized from their Sunday suppers. Mr. Alcott sat at the front with his lawyer, both men in fine suits that spoke of Eastern tailoring. The banker turned as Eleanor and Silas entered, his lip curling in a familiar sneer. But Eleanor refused to let his contempt touch her. She smoothed her skirts and sat down, laying her carpetbag carefully in her lap. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Harrison entered, his gray whiskers neatly trimmed, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He settled into his chair and looked over the assembled group. "We're here today regarding water rights for the spring on Boone property," the judge announced, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "Mr. Alcott claims primary rights through recent purchase. Mr. Boone contests this based on historical documentation. Let's proceed." Alcott's lawyer stood first, a tall man with a watch chain that caught the light. "Your Honor, these supposed documents are clearly forgeries. The dates don't align with territorial records and the signatures are questionable at best. My client has properly registered claims through the current land office." The lawyer went on, presenting maps and newer documents, speaking in legal terms that made Eleanor's head spin. But she noticed how he never quite answered the question of the spring's original ownership. When it was their turn, Silas stood awkwardly. He wasn't used to speaking in formal settings, and Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders. "Your Honor," he began roughly, "that spring's been part of our homestead since my pa first settled there. These papers prove it." The judge leaned forward. "May I see these documents?" Eleanor stood then, her voice clear and steady. "If I may, Your Honor?" At his nod, she approached the bench, drawing the carefully wrapped papers from her bag. "These were found among my father-in-law's effects. They're the original land grant and water rights signed by territorial officials in 1852. She unfolded the papers carefully, pointing out the official seals and signatures. "You'll notice, Your Honor, that the spring is specifically mentioned here, along with its location and flow rate. My father-in-law understood its importance to the homestead and made sure it was properly recorded." The judge studied the documents, holding them up to the light. Alcott's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, we can't verify the authenticity of these convenient discoveries. And surely you won't take the word of—" He paused, his eyes raking over Eleanor's size with obvious disdain. "The word of what, counselor?" Judge Harrison's voice held a sharp edge. "A respected married woman? A homesteader's wife? Please finish your thought." The lawyer subsided, but Alcott himself stood up. "This is ridiculous," he burst out. "They're trying to block progress with forged papers and tall tales. That spring is essential for the railroad's development. Are we going to let these mountain people halt the march of civilization?" Eleanor felt her cheeks flush, but she held her ground. "Your Honor," she said quietly but firmly, "we're not against progress. But that spring feeds more than just our homestead. It waters the entire valley, supporting several families, both settler and native. Mr. Alcott's plans would divert that water solely for railroad use, leaving the rest of us high and dry." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "My husband's father chose that land carefully, understanding its value and responsibility. He registered these rights properly, even if the territorial government's record-keeping wasn't perfect. We're simply asking to protect what's rightfully ours, and by extension, what benefits the whole community." A murmur ran through the watching crowd. Eleanor heard several voices of agreement, including some she recognized from town. Even a few of the regular churchgoers who had once turned away from her were nodding now. Judge Harrison studied the documents for several long minutes, occasionally referring to other papers on his desk. The room grew so quiet, Eleanor could hear the tick of the large wall clock. Finally, he looked up. "This requires further investigation," he announced. "The territorial records from that period are scattered between several jurisdictions. I'll need time to verify these documents properly." He held up his hand as Alcott's lawyer started to speak. "However, given the detailed nature of these papers and the potential community impact, I'm granting temporary protection. No development or changes to the spring's current use will be permitted until this matter is fully resolved." Eleanor felt her knees go weak with relief. Silas's arm came around her waist, strong and sure. Alcott stormed out of the courthouse, his lawyer hurrying behind him, but Eleanor hardly noticed. Around them, people were gathering, offering congratulations and support. "Well spoken, Mrs. Boone," said Martha Wilson, the widow who had become a regular at their Sunday suppers. "You showed real grace up there." "About time someone stood up to Alcott," added Tom Peters, the livery stable owner. "Been throwing his weight around too long." Even the pastor's wife, who had once been so critical, approached with a small smile. "You made us proud today, Eleanor," she said softly. "Sometimes it takes an outsider to help us see what's right." The ride home was quieter than the morning journey, but this time the silence was peaceful. The sun was setting as they crested the last hill before their valley, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Eleanor felt exhausted, but deeply content. At home, after they had seen to the horses and the evening chores, Eleanor lit a single candle and placed it in the window. Its warm light filled the cabin as she sank into her chair by the fire. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, "for giving me strength when I needed it most." Silas knelt beside her chair, taking her hand in his. "You were magnificent today," he said gruffly. "Don't think I tell you enough how proud I am to call you wife." Eleanor smiled, squeezing his hand. "We're not done yet," she reminded him. "The judge still has to make his final ruling." "Don't matter," Silas said firmly. "You showed them all what you're made of, what we're made of together." Outside, a cool evening breeze stirred the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called. Eleanor gazed at the candle's steady flame, thinking of all the changes the past months had brought. She had arrived a stranger, expecting rejection, and found instead a home, a purpose, and a love worth fighting for. The temporary protection wasn't a final victory, but it was hope. Hope for their homestead, hope for the community that had slowly grown around their Sunday suppers, hope for a future where belonging mattered more than appearances. Eleanor said a silent prayer of thanksgiving, watching the candlelight dance against the cabin walls, her husband's strong presence beside her, a reminder that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The autumn wind carried a bitter chill as Eleanor stoked the cabin's hearth. Silas had left before dawn, taking a heavy load of timber to town. She missed his presence already, the quiet strength that filled their small home. Still, there was plenty to keep her busy, mending, baking, and tending to the goats. As evening approached, Eleanor settled into her chair by the fire, working on a new quilt square for Nita. The lamp cast warm shadows on the walls of their cabin, now brightened by the curtains she'd sewn and the dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Every corner held touches of the life they'd built together over these past months. The night grew deeper. Eleanor's eyes grew heavy as she stitched, but something kept her from heading to bed. Maybe it was the unusual stillness outside. No coyotes calling, no owls hooting in the darkness. Even the crickets seemed hushed. The first hint of trouble came as a faint scent of smoke, sharper than the wood smoke from their hearth. Eleanor's head snapped up, needle frozen mid-stitch. Then she heard it, the soft thud of hoofbeats approaching through the trees. Torchlight flickered through the windows, casting eerie shadows. Eleanor's heart pounded as she rose from her chair, her quilting falling forgotten to the floor. Through the glass, she caught glimpses of masked riders circling the cabin. "Time to smoke out the mountain man's prize pig," a rough voice called, followed by cruel laughter. Eleanor recognized the speaker, one of Alcott's hired men from town. The first torch arced through the air, landing on the cabin's shake-shingled roof with a whoosh of flame. More followed, their burning paths lighting up the night. Smoke began seeping through the ceiling as the dry wood caught. Eleanor rushed to the door, but the handle was scorching hot. She yanked her hand back with a cry of pain, backing away as flames began licking through the gaps around the frame. Smoke filled the cabin with frightening speed. Coughing, she stumbled toward the window, but her size made the narrow opening impossible to squeeze through. The heat grew intense as fire spread across the roof. Eleanor's eyes stung, tears streaming down her face as she struggled to breathe in the thickening smoke. "Help!" She tried to call out, but her voice emerged as a strangled whisper. The room spun around her as she gasped for air. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, consciousness fading. Through the roar of the flames, she dimly heard shouts in Arapaho. Something crashed, the door splintering inward. Strong hands grabbed her arms, dragging her across the rough floorboards. "Eleanor, stay with us," Nita's voice cut through the haze. Cool night air suddenly hit Eleanor's face as they pulled her clear of the burning cabin. She lay in the dirt, coughing violently as Nita's sons ran past with wet blankets, beating at the flames that had caught her skirts. Above them, the cabin's roof groaned ominously. "Move her further back," Nita ordered. They half-carried, half-dragged Eleanor to a safe distance just as the roof collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. Eleanor watched through streaming eyes as their home, the cabin where she'd finally found belonging, was consumed by fire. The heat was intense even from yards away, the flames reflecting off the scattered snow patches that had survived the day's sun. "I'm so sorry," Eleanor wheezed between coughs. "All our things, everything we built, gone because of me. I'm nothing but a burden." Her voice broke on the last word. "Hush now," Nita said firmly, pressing a water skin to Eleanor's cracked lips. "You are no burden. You are the heart of this valley, the strength that brings people together." Eleanor tried to protest, but another fit of coughing overtook her. Her lungs felt raw, and every breath was an effort. Nita's sons returned from checking the goat pen, reporting that they'd managed to free the animals before the fire spread. "The livestock will scatter to graze," Nita said. "We can round them up tomorrow. For now, you need shelter and medicine for your breathing." She turned to her older son. "Run ahead and prepare the lodge. Heat water for tea." The young man nodded and disappeared into the darkness. Nita and her younger son helped Eleanor to her feet. She swayed, dizzy from the smoke, but they steadied her. The walk to Nita's lodge seemed endless. Eleanor's chest burned with each step, and her legs trembled with exhaustion. But Nita and her son never wavered, supporting her weight between them. Finally, they ducked through the lodge entrance. Inside, warm firelight glowed, and the air was sweet with healing herbs. Nita's older son had already laid out clean blankets and was tending a small cooking fire. "Here, sit," Nita guided Eleanor down onto the soft furs. "Dark thoughts will keep until morning. Now we focus on healing." Eleanor sank gratefully onto the bedding, still coughing intermittently. Nita mixed herbs in a clay cup, adding hot water and honey. "Drink," she instructed. "It will ease your breathing." The tea was bitter but soothing. As Eleanor sipped, Nita's son slipped out to keep watch, in case the attackers returned. Nita busied herself preparing a poultice for Eleanor's burned hand, humming softly, an old Arapaho melody that seemed to make the air itself more peaceful. "I should have known Alcott would do something like this," Eleanor whispered hoarsely. "He's so angry about the water rights." "The banker's anger burns hot but shallow," Nita replied, applying the cooling poultice. "Your strength runs deeper, like the spring itself." She wrapped Eleanor's hand carefully in clean cloth. "Rest now. Morning will bring a clearer thoughts." Eleanor wanted to stay awake to plan what to tell Silas to worry about their future. But the tea was working its magic, and exhaustion pulled at her like a heavy blanket. The last thing she saw before sleep took her was Nita's face in the firelight, weathered and wise, watching over her with quiet determination. Outside, smoke still rose from the ruins of the cabin, curling up toward the stars. But inside the lodge, wrapped in borrowed blankets and surrounded by the gentle sounds of Nita's household, Eleanor slept, battered but alive, saved by the very community she had helped to build. The night settled into watchful silence. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called, a single clear note that seemed to promise tomorrow would bring new beginnings, even from the ashes of loss. Dawn broke cold and clear over the valley. Silas urged his horse faster along the trail home, eager to share news from his timber sale with Eleanor. But as he crested the final rise, his heart stopped. Where their cabin should have stood, only smoking ruins remained. "Eleanor!" His shout echoed across the valley as he spurred his horse forward. The animal's hooves thundered against the frozen ground as they galloped toward the blackened timbers. Smoke still rose from the ashes, curling gray against the morning sky. Silas leaped from the saddle before his horse fully stopped, stumbling toward the ruins. The roof had completely collapsed, leaving only charred walls standing like broken teeth against the sky. Their bed, Eleanor's quilting, his father's Bible, all gone. "Eleanor," he called again, voice cracking. Fear clawed at his throat as he searched frantically for any sign of his wife. "She is safe." Nita's voice came from behind him. He whirled to find her standing at the edge of the clearing. "She rests in my lodge." Silas's legs nearly gave out with relief. Without a word, he strode after Nita as she led him to her home. Inside the lodge, Eleanor lay sleeping on a bed of furs, her face peaceful, despite angry red burns on one hand and soot still streaking her cheeks. At his entrance, her eyes fluttered open. "Silas," she whispered hoarsely. He fell to his knees beside her, gathering her carefully into his arms. "Who did this?" His voice was deadly quiet. "Alcott's men." Eleanor's words dissolved into a fit of coughing. They came with torches in the night. Rage blazed through Silas's body, hot as the flames that had devoured their home. His hands shook as he held Eleanor, imagining her trapped inside the burning cabin. "I'll kill them," he growled. "Every last one." "No." Eleanor clutched at his shirt with her unburned hand. "Please, no more violence. That's not the way." "They tried to murder you." Silas's voice rose sharply. "They meant you to burn alive in our own home. And if you kill them, you'll hang." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I can't lose you, Silas. Not to revenge, please." Something broke inside Silas then. A dam he'd built decades ago when his first wife died. Tears spilled down his weathered cheeks as great, racking sobs tore from his chest. "When I saw the ruins," he choked out, I thought I'd lost you too. The land, the cabin, none of it matters compared to you." His scarred hands trembled as he stroked her hair. "I've never been so scared." Eleanor pulled him closer, her own tears falling. "I'm here," she whispered. "God sent Nita to save me. He's not finished with us yet." They held each other as the morning light strengthened outside the lodge. Nita quietly prepared healing tea, giving them space for their grief and reunion. Later that evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of flame, Silas and Eleanor sat together on a fallen log near their ruined cabin. The ashes had cooled enough to approach, though smoke still rose in places where deep embers smoldered. Eleanor leaned against Silas's shoulder, wrapped in a blanket Nita had given her. Her breathing was easier now, though she still coughed occasionally. "We can rebuild," she said softly, "start fresh." Silas's arm tightened around her. "We will, but first I'll see justice done. Proper justice, through the law." He turned to meet her eyes. "I swear to you, Eleanor, no matter how much my hands itch for revenge, I'll not take it. We'll fight this battle in the courthouse, not with guns." Eleanor smiled, touching his cheek where tears had tracked through trail dust that morning. "That's the good man I married," she said. "The one who knows love is stronger than hate." They sat together as darkness crept across the valley, watching the last light fade from the mountains. Their home lay in ashes behind them, but their love burned brighter than ever, a flame no amount of violence could extinguish. The morning sun cast long shadows as Silas and Eleanor's wagon rolled slowly into town. Soot still darkened their clothes, and the smell of smoke clung to Eleanor's shawl. She sat tall beside Silas despite her bandaged hand and occasional cough, her chin lifted against the stares of townsfolk. Word of the burning spread like wildfire through the streets. "Alcott's men tried to murder the mountain man's wife," whispered mothers outside the general store. "Set fire to their cabin while she slept," muttered men near the smithy. The preacher stood on his church steps watching their approach. Shame colored his face as he remembered his earlier coldness. He hurried down to meet their wagon, his boots raising dust. "Mrs. Boone," he called out. "Mr. Boone, what was done to you? It's unconscionable." He twisted his hat in his hands. "The Lord commands us to love our neighbors. We failed you both." Eleanor's voice was hoarse but clear. "There's still time to make it right, Reverend." The preacher straightened his shoulders. "Indeed there is." He turned to the gathering crowd. "Brothers and sisters, who here will stand against this evil?" Sarah Miller, a widow whose children Eleanor had fed, stepped forward first. "I'll testify how she shared her bread when we had none," she declared. Her 3 small children clustered around her skirts, nodding vigorously. Old Mrs. Peterson, whom Eleanor had nursed through fever, raised her gnarled hand. "She sat with me 3 nights running, singing hymns till dawn." More voices joined in. The cooper spoke of Eleanor's fair trades, the seamstress of her kind words. Rough-handed loggers cleared their throats and spoke of Silas's honest dealings and true measure of timber. Through it all, Eleanor gripped Silas's hand, tears gleaming in her eyes. Each voice seemed to wash away a little more of the smoke and fear. Alcott appeared on the bank's porch, his face darkening at the gathering crowd. "This is absurd," he blustered. "You can't prove anything against me?" But his hired men, watching from the shadows of the saloon, began slipping away one by one. They wanted no part of attempted murder charges. As evening approached, the preacher opened the church doors wide. Lanterns glowed in every window as townsfolk filed in, filling the wooden pews. Eleanor sat at the battered piano, her burned hand carefully wrapped but still able to pick out the melody. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound," she began, her rich contralto rising clear and strong. "That saved a wretch like me." One by one, voices joined hers. The widow's children, the logger's rough bass, the seamstress's sweet soprano. Silas stood beside Eleanor, singing for the first time since his first wife died, his voice cracking with emotion. Tears flowed freely as the hymn swelled, filling every corner of the church. Something new was being born in that moment. A community united in purpose, standing together against cruelty and greed. Through the church windows, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of hope, as the last verse echoed across the town. "When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun." The courthouse buzzed with tension as townsfolk packed the wooden benches. Morning light streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes in its beams. Judge Harrison's gavel cracked against wood, bringing silence. One by one, witnesses approached the bench. Sarah Miller spoke of Alcott's threats to seize her farm. Loggers testified about his schemes to control the timber rights. Nita, standing proud in her finest dress, described pulling Eleanor from the burning cabin. When Eleanor rose to speak, her bandaged hands trembled slightly. Silas moved to help her, but she steadied herself against the rail. The court fell silent, waiting. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and strong despite the lingering smoke damage. "The spring water belongs to everyone, not just to us but to every family in this valley, white or Arapaho. That's how God intended it." Her simple words rang with truth. The judge nodded slowly, studying the documents before him. "The water rights are valid," he declared. "Furthermore, Mr. Alcott will face charges of arson and fraud." Cheers erupted as two deputies led Alcott away in handcuffs. Eleanor sagged against Silas, tears of relief streaming down her face. His strong arm supported her as justice prevailed at last. The valley echoed with the thud of axes and ring of hammers. Where ashes had marked defeat, hope now rose log by log. Nita and her sons arrived at dawn, rolling fresh-cut timber down the slope. Her eldest, strong Bear, showed the others how to notch corners in the Arapaho way, making walls that would stand against any storm. Widow Thompson brought a colorful quilt she'd saved for her daughter's wedding. "For your bed," she said, pressing it into Eleanor's hands. Children scampered about, gathering smooth stones for the new hearth, their laughter mixing with the tap of hammers. Eleanor's big cookpot bubbled constantly over the outdoor fire. "Come eat," she'd call, ladling out rich stew and cornbread. Workers gathered round, sharing stories and warmth as light snow dusted their shoulders. The new cabin grew larger than the old, with proper windows and a wide door Eleanor could pass through easily. After 3 weeks of work, Silas disappeared into his workshop. He emerged with a rocking chair, carved with pine boughs and hearts. "For you," he mumbled, cheeks red beneath his beard. Eleanor's eyes welled up as she settled into it. She pulled Silas down for a kiss on his weathered cheek. "I've never known such happiness," she whispered, her words meant for him alone. In this moment, watching their neighbors raise walls born of kindness, Eleanor knew they'd built more than just a cabin. They'd built a home. Snow whirled outside the windows of the new cabin like white feathers in the wind. Inside, warmth and light spilled from every corner as townsfolk crowded shoulder to shoulder. Lanterns cast a golden glow across familiar faces, now softened with friendship. The preacher stepped forward, hat in hand, his voice thick with emotion. "Before we begin our celebration, I must speak." He turned to Eleanor, seated in her carved rocker. "Sister Hayes, I failed you with judgment instead of welcome. I ask your forgiveness." Eleanor's gentle smile was answer enough. She reached for his hand, squeezing it once before letting go. As the blessing ended, Silas rose suddenly from his chair. His calloused fingers found Eleanor's, drawing her up beside him. "Folks," he said, voice gruff but clear, "that first day at the station, I told you all. She's perfect." His declaration rang through the quiet room. Still is. Always will be. Tears flowed freely as applause filled the cabin. Eleanor's rich voice lifted in amazing grace, others joining until the hymn soared to the rafters. Later, after the last guest had vanished into the snowy night, Eleanor and Silas sat close by their new hearth. Their joined hands rested between them, wedding bands glinting in the firelight. Outside, beneath winter's blanket, the spring bubbled steadfast and true, promising tomorrow's blessings. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.